We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build a decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast. Hey everyone, Elisa Wood here from Energy Changemakers. So it turns out that humans have created so much stuff and so much of it turns into waste that it likely now exceeds the weight of all living matter on Earth. I learned this from one of my favorite energy economists, Skip Laitner, our guest today. Many of you know Skip from his years at the EPA and the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, or through the hundreds of papers and reports and articles he's authored. Skip talks about how waste affects the productive use of energy and ultimately our economy. I took a lot away from this conversation, and I think you will too. Here we go. Hey, everybody. I'm here today with one of my favorite people to speak to. Every conversation I have with Skip Laitner, I walk away just thinking about things in a new way. He recently passed on to me a paper he wrote called Living More by Waste Than Ingenuity, a critical look at the scale of materials, stuff, and waste within U.S. residential buildings and beyond. And it has so much resonance for the kind of discussions we're having now in terms of growing demand for energy. So hello, Skip. How are you today?
Well, delighted to hear and hope this is not going to be a waste of your time.
Oh, never. Never is when I talk to you. So first of all, let me ask you, what led you to write this paper? What was its purpose?
It all began actually some years ago when I was invited to do a sabbatical here at the University of Arizona. I think it's maybe 2011, so 14 years ago, when I got to thinking about the scale of resources that we use and how little we actually put them to good work to help our economy, to help our homes, our communities, and how much more of it ends up as waste rather than useful products, both energy and materials. And I've got colleagues at the Weizmann Institute of Science, that's a university science group in Israel, that put out a journal article 4 years ago that said all of the human-made mass, all the anthropogenic mass, what I sometimes refer to as the human-made mess, likely now exceeds the weight of all the living matter on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And as I have previously discussed with Newton's third law of motion, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And if we're generating that scale of waste, it's driving some unfortunate circumstances, whether our health as a community, our medical, physical health, or the economy, because we're being burdened by so much unused resource that is now allowing our economy to be as robust, as resilient to the political discussion, the policy discussion, I should say. I'm trying to keep politics out of it. But the policy arenas need to understand more. It's kind of like if I were a physician and you were my patient, and if I only looked at you using an X-ray, I would not see how healthy you are. But if I use MRIs or CT scans and we're able to get a deeper dive into everything from the blood flow to the way your organs function as opposed to just your skeleton, I might be able to help you better understand how to maintain and improve your overall health as an individual, but also in this case, as a community, as a nation, as a global economy. So it's that picture that brought it forward. And we're so used to talking about economics in the pure data sense, but more like an economist would use X-rays only rather than data that helps us understand our organs, our tissue, our shape, our functions, our energy efficiencies as individuals, as economies.
Yeah. Let's dive into some of that data that you pulled together. I love the fact that you did it in terms of households. You really sort of gave some perspective that I could grasp because I understand what a household is, right? So let's go through some of those figures. Tell us some of the figures that you came up with to paint the picture of what's happening here.
Yeah, and while I'm an economist, I understand households as well. In fact, I sometimes think of myself more as a kitchen chemist than a cook. and more as a wildlife biologist than somebody trying to maintain the household in good condition, how it fits together and helps people within the household, but your neighbors, your community. But yeah, as an example, by one estimate, the average household might waste something on the order of $900 of food per year. There are about 129, 130 million households in the U.S. That means we're wasting about $117 billion of food. And then we might have to see that households have an average of 1.83 cars per household, which means that we have to have not just homes and places to live, but we have to have parking space equivalents for about 236 million cars in all of our residential spaces. And that consumes space, it erodes the soil, it requires huge amounts of asphalt, cement, metals, rebar, steel, things like that, that could be put to better use in ways that provide a more, again, resilient, more robust economy and greater employment opportunities. So that's one example.
You get into things here like shoes, the amount of shoes we have, this number of suitcases we need.
Yeah.
All of these things that need to be housed somewhere, right? We have so much stuff. We need to put the stuff somewhere. We need to have all this housing for the stuff. It's fascinating what it does to us. We don't tend to think of energy in that way, right? We tend to think of energy just in terms of, well, the economy is growing, the demand has gone up X amount, we need this much more energy, more power plants, more whatever. But if you bring it back down to how we're actually living our lives, demand can actually be more controllable.
Or even more productive, so we can put things to use, better use than we are now. Shoes, for example, I've estimated, and it's in the spirit of, as I've said, a Fermi thought experiment. Enrico Fermi was the Nobel physicist who won the award in 1938. I didn't agree with all that he did, but I liked his thinking. And he would step back, and when he, for example, was the first person to estimate the power of the Trinity bomb in 1945 simply by taking little pieces of paper and letting them float as the shock waves hit where he was underground. And he measured the distance those little pieces of paper traveled and estimated that the Trinity was on the order of 10 kilotons of explosion. He was very close to the actual outcome we now think is 21 kilotons. So I use a lot of thought experiments to try to illustrate. And in that same spirit, the average American owns about 12 pairs of shoes. And for households, we probably need about 2.7 billion pairs of shoes in our households. And we probably need 330 million suitcases of luggage in our households. That's all stuff. And we throw away about 22 billion pairs of shoes a year globally. So that's unused resources. So instead of extending things and letting them last a little bit longer, instead of making them something that we can reuse, repurpose in new ways, if we throw them away, it ends up as really a drain on our economy, a drain on our community well-being. So it's that kind of spirit. And energy is what's necessary to handle all of it, whether it's the processing of materials, the delivery of the materials, or the managing of the waste. And so energy is behind all of it, as I think I've shared with you before. Labor without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. And data and water without energy do not flow. And plants without energy do not grow. So by not really stepping back and understanding the larger picture beyond the market, if we understand the metabolism of our economy, not simply the market exchange, but the full metabolism of how we put energy and materials to use, we're going to be able to do a much better job of maintaining a more robust and more resilient and more prosperous future, should we choose to make that happen.
And so correct me if I'm wrong, but you're not proposing like a degrowth approach. I think what you're saying, you point out Newton's, as you said earlier, third law of motion. For
Right.
every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So by having all of this pressure on the ecosystem, by having all of this waste, by having all of this stuff,
Yes.
obviously we know that hurts the environment. We lose, I think you said butterflies, right? That's a good example. We
Yeah.
lose butterflies.
Yes.
We lose something. So in a way, that is degrowth, right? Because something can't grow because we have this other pressure all the time.
Exactly.
Too much stuff.
It's more of a repurposing and reusing than wasting. And the more we could step back and look at not simple market data, economic data, but understand, as you just said, the amount of soil we use as an economy, we erode every year, or the amount of butterflies and bees we're losing, which go a long way to pollinating our crops to make sure we have healthy food to eat, that we even have food at all to eat. So it's a reuse, a repurpose, or doing things differently, but still enabling a strong household, a good community, and a really solid society at large. So yes, repurposing more than degrowth.
So we're not saying sacrifice. We're saying, let's get back to where we can have more of this other good stuff.
Which means, yes, and the more we understand that as a body politic, the more we can see that, yeah, maybe we do need to do things differently to enable our well-being to improve as a community. So it's not degrowth, but it's a repurposing or enabling more productive, more prosperous outcomes.
Let's talk about it in terms of energy, because we are in such an interesting place right now. For the first time in decades, we're seeing growth in demand for electricity.
Yes.
And it's often attributed to data centers and electrification, and to some degree, an increase in manufacturing. And there's a lot of debate, you and I have talked about this, a lot of debate about whether or not the demand will be as great as some of the projections right now. There's some belief that efficiencies will come into play that haven't been calculated into those numbers so far.
Yep.
But still, it's there. There is some degree of growth. It's pretty clear there's going to be some new demand for energy. And I guess what you're talking about is something beyond energy efficiency. You're talking about
I call it energy productivity.
Energy productivity,
Of which efficiency is one element, of which transition over to renewables, because for every kilowatt hour in renewables that we generate, we may be avoiding 1.4, 1.8 kilowatt hours of wasted generation energy, or getting closer to a 1-to-1 ratio instead of 2.4, 2.8 units of coal or to generate a kilowatt hour. We're getting closer to 1-to-1 because we're tapping into the sun. So we're saving money that way by moving away from combustion technologies. And then finally, a repurposing of resources so that we have a more circular economy rather than things being wasted. We step back and use them in whole new ways, new opportunities that might be available if we'll step back and look at it in a reworking, a repurposing, a redoing, or doing it differently kind of spirit. So energy and resource productivity is how I frame it, yes.
And we touched a little bit on, when we were talking before, about what this means to distributed energy. And I was thinking about that. I'm not exactly sure how distributed energy plays into this discussion, but one way I think it does is that when you have energy that's closer to you, local, that you're more aware of, you're also more aware of waste and how much you use it. I was just thinking, I was just visiting an uncle in Connecticut who put solar panels on his roof and a couple of heat pumps in his house. And he took out his bills and wanted to ask me some questions about it. And we had a whole discussion about how he was using energy. And I thought, if he had not put those solar panels on his roof, we wouldn't have been pulling out his bills and talking about energy. You know, it just comes in from that wire and you don't really think about it. So.
Right. Well, actually, you're drawing a really good comparison. One of the things I'm focusing on is the idea of what I refer to as biological scaling. So, for example, a mouse that weighs 1 ounce may require 4 kilocalories of food per day. An elephant, which may weigh not 1 ounce, but 192,000 ounces, requires only 0.2 kilocalories of food per day because it has a better nervous system and especially a blood system that is like the distributed energy that we're talking about here. We more productively get the blood to the tissue where it's needed in a better fashion, that we don't need as much food, because if an elephant ate as much as a mouse did, its body tissue, its bones, its nervous system would overheat and melt practically in very big ways. So the distributed energy system, and you've given me an idea for maybe what I might include in a paper I'm writing, is like the scaling of the blood system within elephants that allow us to use less energy per unit, per ounce, per pound than what a mouse might require. So yes, and distributed resources enable people to use things closer to their homes so that buildings become power plants, because we can put solar systems as part of the walls or as part of the pavement or as on the roof, and it's more close to where it's used. And then with better information, dare I say, even AI, to manage how these things are used more productively as well, to enable a collaborative enterprise within communities as opposed to just being a home independent of the system. It's a home that's more vitally connected and interacting because of smart management systems, information, AI managed systems that make it happen. So yes, I think there's a strong connection there. That also then reduces the overall energy we need. I think I've shared with you my colleague Saul Griffith, who wrote the book Electrify in 2021.
Great book.
Yeah, good book. He highlighted that, yeah, we need more electricity. We need to electrify in so many ways, but that if we do it right, we end up using half the total energy that we're using because we're using it much, much more productively. Electric vehicles may get 120 miles per gallon equivalent, for example, or 140 miles per gallon equivalent versus maybe a Chevy might get 29 miles per gallon. So moving in that way, but with distributed access to resources in new ways, we end up using less in it. We use more electricity, absolutely, but less total energy by a very big amount.
You mentioned something about the amount of primary energy we're using. I'm going to quote you wrong, so I almost don't want to say this. But you mentioned something about it being less or going down.
Yeah, you're right. Primary energy is the total energy, both the energy used to provide, say, electricity with coal-fired generation versus end-use energy, which is the energy that we pull out of our sockets at home or in our factories, what have you. And primary energy can be reduced even as our economic well-being is expanded. So we have more jobs for people, but we have to step back and ask that question. Our colleagues at the Energy Information Administration had their latest forecast out for the year 2050. They stopped doing it in 2024 just to give themselves a break to do more modeling and to improve the metrics they were using in their national energy modeling system. So in 2023, they said by the year 2050, we may have to use 106 quadrillion BTUs of primary energy. But now they've said, close to what I forecast, we may need only 88 quads. We're using about 95 quads today, but by 2050, we may be using only 88 quads, and that can even be improved in ways that ensure the robustness of our GDP, but even putting more people to work. So Saul Griffith laid this out very nicely. I helped him with some of his job estimates and calculations in that book, but he really did a really first-rate job of laying out some of the key fundamentals. Again, focusing on what is the purpose of energy, not just whether it's supply or adequate supply, but how more productively we can put that energy to work in new ways, new forms of energy that get the job done, if you will.
Does the EIA give a reason why we will be using fewer quads of energy?
Yeah, partly because we're doing a better job of accounting, but partly because they're also including things like the effects of, dare I say, the Inflation Reduction Act or the Investment Infrastructure Jobs Act or the CHIPS Act, because those are stepping forward and they're projecting that if we're able to continue that, we're going to be in a much healthier economy, even as we're more productive in the way we use energy and other resources. They've done a pretty good job of reframing their forecast in the future. Although, one caveat, I'm still worried that we may end up with fewer revenues to provide things like Social Security, our social well-being, our environmental, medical health, our community services, because of that erosion per capita GDP. So we may need to step up an even greater energy productivity level than what the EIA is now projecting to restore that resilience to really expand our social and economic opportunity together by reducing waste in a very big way.
I imagine, too, some of their inputs may change if we lose pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act, like the incentive tax credits or some other
Exactly right.
provisions that would give us more efficient and cleaner energy.
That's right.
So let's talk a little bit about policy, because I know you're also involved in that end of things a bit. What do we need to do policy-wise to make these improvements?
Good question, and a critically important one, because policy can enable a better outcome, but that enabling has to be brought about through a more proactive and a bigger investment in both people and infrastructure. Instead of thinking about this as a cost, if we think about this as an investment with a return, if we think about this investment as a friend with many benefits, if you will, we need to increase the scale of investment to do so in ways that focus on a more productive use of energy and other resources, whether steel, whether minerals, whether soil, whether chemicals, and feedstock of the production of our various goods in the market. So we need to step up our investment enabled by smarter policies that leverage both the public investment. Public investment may be for things like research and development, job training, workforce development, managing programs, but private investment. So for every dollar of, say, public investment, we might imagine $7 to $9 of private investment being stimulated. Both the public and the private dollars together are improving our infrastructure. We've got what was the number I came up with? 105 billion square feet of commercial space in this country, existing commercial space that needs to be ramped up, and the performance of both water consumption, feedstocks of all kinds, energy in particular. We need to be more productive in how we use that 105 billion commercial square feet, even as we grow that number in a very big way over the next 26 years. And policy, as we think of policy not as a limitation, but as a means to enable both the public and the private sectors to generate a bigger investment. And we end up saving money as a result. If we invest in efficiency and renewables, we may pay $1,000 to do that, but we might save $150 or even more on an annual basis, depending on what choices we make and the way we deploy those dollars. So we got to think of investment.
Over time, it's an investment that pays off more than pays off. I think I remember you actually thought the Inflation Reduction Act could have been more, right? We needed more money than that, larger investment than that.
The report we did for Senator Schumer back in 2021, my colleague Jeremy Rifkin and Black and Veatch and World Resources Institute and I put together a big report for Senator Schumer in 2021. We laid out the need for an investment that is on the order of $20 to $25 trillion over time, not any given year, but over time. And the Inflation Reduction Act was barely a down payment. I think we had something on the order of, $387 billion when we needed to be more like, and that's over 10 years, we needed more like $800 to $900 billion a year for 20 some years. So it was a step forward, but we need a bigger investment. And as you said, that investment will have many returns if we're enabling it through smart policy.
So we're heading the wrong way right now. I think it's fair to say, as we're speaking, I should tell our listeners, the Senate is debating the reconciliation bill. We don't know how it's going to turn out. By the time you listen to this, something will have happened one way or the other. But certainly the mood is to curb that investment in clean energy, and energy efficiency is really getting walloped. So,
and the reason for that.
How are you feeling, Skip? What are you thinking?
Personally, I'm feeling pretty good, but from the economy's perspective, I'm nervous about it because, unfortunately, that legislation is looking at energy supply, more oil, coal, natural gas, as the preferred energy forms rather than looking at how more productively energy could be put to work. So they're looking at it as a supply perspective and competing supplies rather than understanding the bigger picture of how more productive use of energy and new forms of energy that are available to us. And in fact, we know that solar, for example, is already cheaper than nuclear and coal. So they're looking only at the supply side, not at the larger social economic consequences of that new recipe for the economy. We need to shift gears in a more productive way. And so we're taking basically a 1970s market view rather than looking into the future to see how that Newton's third law is affecting our social, our economic, our environmental well-being.
Isn't part of the problem that we can make money by building supply? But can we make money? Can I, as a energy developer, can I make money by becoming more productive or by creating more productive inputs?
Yes. So if you're a solar developer of some sort and you invest in solar, you're making money. And we need to expand that market. So we have new solar wind resources, but also energy information management systems to really help us deploy those solar resources in distributed fashion, healthy ways. But because we're saving money, instead of spending money on energy, which are very non-labor intensive, very capital intensive, but non-labor intensive, that frees up money for households and businesses to spend on other goods and services that promote more employment and that provide a greater satisfaction than just having access to energy. So we've got better food, we've got better clothing, we've got better uses of materials in ways that allow people to make money as well as a result of managing these evolving markets. So if we focus only on, taking away money from, say, oil and gas investment, that's a loss. But if we divert through purposeful investment and through smart policy into things like solar wind efficiency, then we're not only still stimulating construction and manufacturing, but we're doing it in a way that allows households and businesses to benefit from savings that can be respent in new ways, whether for education, whether for theaters, whether for restaurants, whether for books, food, what have you. And that set of markets can really go a long way to enabling the communities to have a healthier outcome.
So we need to think big picture, not special interest.
We need to think of, dare I say, the idea of governance. And here I'm drawing on the Greek root word. The word government originally comes from the Greek root word meaning to navigate or steer, but we've come to understand it as government as to tax us to death and take away our freedoms. But government, if we navigate or steer, can become an enabling step forward. And with investments that are productive in both people and infrastructure, we're creating a more robust social economic well-being, even as we're also helping the environment, the climate burdens that we're facing, which have their own consequences and economic penalties as well. So we need to think about government as a means to navigate or steer our economy to a more proactive, more productive outcome that engages and supports our communities.
Great. Well, this has been inspiring as always. I always learn when I talk to you. I want to ask you, the paper that I mentioned at the beginning, has that been presented yet? Is it available anywhere that people can take a look at it?
Well, I wrote it up originally for a summit that was held last week here at Biosphere 2, if people are familiar with that place here in Tucson, just outside of Tucson, University of Arizona's Biosphere 2. We had a Building Innovation Connection Summit, about 4 people getting together for 3 days. And I really wanted to help them think through the scale of resources in buildings and the scale of waste produced in the use of and the production of those buildings. So I wrote, it's a 2-pager, really. It's a set of Fermi thought experiments, if you will, just to help step back and understand this larger picture. But yes, it's available. I can make it available, or if you want to post it on the website so people could download it, I'm totally okay with that.
Let's do that. We can put a link with the show notes so people who listen can download it.
There you go.
Okay, well, wonderful. Well, thank you again so much for getting on the show today, for joining us on the show today. Again, love talking to you, and let's do it again in a few months.
Yeah, thank you so much for your own efforts and for the Energy Changemakers. It's a critical element of helping move that step forward in a positive direction, big step forward in a positive direction. So thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.